Nathan Pinkoski. Welcome to Thinking Class. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Well, Nathan, you have wide-ranging academic interests, and we'll be talking about some of those things today. The recently late philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre and the impact of his work and what it means for our understanding of the past and modernity and what we can learn from his intellectual humility, but also a bit about the machine age we'll get into. It's something that is being talked about by philosophers, writers, commentators across the political speech sphere. And we can also talk a little bit about the very controversial book in some circles, The Camp of the Saints, which you have written a foreword to, and it is being published in Europe and the US later this year. So before we get into all of that, Nathan, maybe we start with who it is you are and how you ended up to have all of these different focuses.
Wonderful. Well, as I said, it's a delight to be here. So I was born in Canada and did in Alberta and did my first kind of intellectual training, academic training in political theory. So very much someone who came out of the humanistic background, or at least the desire to speak to a McIntyrean theme, perhaps the desire to assemble the fragments of that kind of education. Went on to do master's and doctorate at Oxford, again in political theory. That's where I really started reading McIntyre, Alasdair MacIntyre, very carefully. Ended up writing a chapter on him for my thesis. And then I think after that stage, like many people, this was sort of 2016, 2017, you had a sense of seismic political shifts going on. You were trying to understand that. And one of the dynamics that influenced me in that time that I was thinking about was just what it is to pass through a revolution. I became more interested in French political thought, much of which is developed in response to, at least in modern times, right, in response to the French Revolution, what it is to think in response to a serious political and social rupture. So became more interested in that. And then the other side of it too, I think, was just after a while, when you're engaging with these debates about say, to speak on a McIntyrean theme, what liberalism is, has it come to an end, it is exhausted, in what way, what's good about it, what's bad, these kinds of grand debates that are very much the preoccupation of political theorists. I began to think more and more that these debates were actually downstream of technological change. And the more I thought about that and reflected on that, that was the kind of insight I wanted to develop further and further. And perhaps this is the McIntyrean side of me, but I wanted a practice to do this in. So I worked, collaborated with another academic, a professor at Catholic University of America, Jonathan Osconis, whose writings I very much recommend, and Mary Harrington, whose writings, of course, I very much recommend, to develop a course that would kind of pursue this theme. And that's something that we've been running, the three of us, for a few years now. And the more that I've taught it, the more that I've engaged in that practice, the more I've thought about it and reflected on it, and wanted to better understand the mad times that we live in. So that's a brief little itinerary there about how I became interested in those themes. But I'd say now the kinds of things I end up writing about or thinking about, there's still the humanistic kind of classical training in political theory that interests me. But the two things that occupy most of my attention are trying to reflect on the sorts of technological changes that we live in, and how they've reshaped our political order. And then the questions in French political thought too, responding to revolution, trying to understand that, and look for thinkers in that tradition who are neglected or not given attention in the English-speaking world, but who should be.
Well, before we perhaps get on to our understanding of today's political events and whether we're witnessing some kind of proto-revolution within the Western world, and indeed the impact of technology on our politics. I'm sure there's much ink to be spilled or words to be put into the digital ether on that one. Let's get into Alasdair MacIntyre, because what you've just opened with of how you've ended up, what you've been interested in your academic studies, explains why you're so into McIntyre, because he opens his famous book, After Virtue, published in 1982, with a thought experiment. And I'm paraphrasing somewhat here, so you as the subject matter expert can put me right where I'm wrong, but he talks about a world in which there are in the world of science. I think he does a lab experiment, or there's a lab out somewhere, and effectively the society in which they live is kind of being destroyed. There are only a few documents left which they could possibly rebuild everything that they thought their society knew on that basis. But the problem was they miss important details. There are a whole bunch of concepts that they don't fully understand, but they employ them anyway. And I think he goes on to apply the analogy that this is true of us in the modern era, particularly with regards to, as you've been talking about, the humanities, the wisdom tradition, but to classical Christianity too, that we no longer understand virtue in the sense of the classical Greek philosophy, even if we do sometimes talk about it, even if we do hold up virtue as being the highest good. So maybe we can think about, to begin with, Nathan, why do we think Alasdair MacIntyre's book After Virtue became this must-read for students and has had this long-reaching impact where it makes people realize just how much we've lost from the past? What is it about his work that has been so everlasting?
Yeah, so I think the image that you noted there, I think, is a really arresting one. It's drawn from the science fiction novel Canticle for Leibowitz, which imagines this monastic order that exists after a nuclear apocalypse, after a nuclear war. And the purpose of the monastic order is simply to assemble the fragments that remain of the natural sciences, to try to build them up again over time. So you have these scenes where a monk is going out into the desert, and then he'll discover some ruin, and he'll pull out a fragment of some blueprint. It's a very powerful image. And the provocation, if you will, that McIntyre has is that this is the state that we actually live in with respect to, as you say, humanities, and more particularly the moral sciences, our ethical experience. So it's a provocation because we then have to think, well, what was the nuclear holocaust that we went through? What was that? And then secondly, it's that we think when we think we're doing or engaging in thinking about ethics, we're actually not. We're just assembling these little fragments of blueprints that we have no understanding of, and trying to conjecture whole elaborate accounts of what these are, when really we know very little. And I think the arresting power of it, and the reason why the book and this way of thinking has persisted for so long, is almost, I think it almost came too early. I think in the 70s and 80s, there were obviously people who perceived the breakdown of our moral language, the breakdown, these kinds of things that we see now all the time in our political discourse, right? Hyper-partisanship, inability to talk to the other side, breakdown of civil discourse. And McIntyre allows us to raise that as a problem, and also I think this is key, to really understand that the problem has to do with a lack of unity and a lack of a common destination. And that's hard, I think, to grasp for a lot of us, and even the people who use the language and complain about the lack of civility or hyper-partisanship. They're still hesitant to see fragmentation, or let me put it like this, diversity, a diversity of ethical theories or ethical opinions as a problem. They want to celebrate this, think this is exactly where we should be in a kind of modern situation where you have a variety of options to choose from. But McIntyre sees, or at least he argued, that this is not actually in itself a good thing. It poses a problem. When you don't have unity, when you don't have a common moral language, there's a problem here. And in the 80s, into the 90s and 2000s, right, it was very hard for people to see that. I think we're now at a stage where, because of the general political situation in most Western countries, the general social situation, we're now able to pick up after virtue and say, aha, he's talking about us. Maybe he has something to speak to us. And maybe this fixation that we had for a long time on diversity or fragmentation or a variety of opinions as being in itself a good thing doesn't actually help us in any deep way.
You've referred to Alasdair MacIntyre in your obituary of him in Compact as the reluctant godfather of post-liberalism, and you can expound on why that is the case, that he occupies that role. But within that obituary you wrote, you talk about at the beginning of your article just how much of an exercise in intellectual humility that McIntyre was exercising through After Virtue, because effectively what he was chronicling was his own path from being part of the Marxist school to having disavowed it and ending up on an intellectual journey, which led him to those discoveries that you've just so concisely put, which is, we've seen the fragmentation of our whole order, our whole societal order, and for these reasons. Why is it that you think he's the reluctant godfather of post-liberalism? And perhaps you can also just describe a little bit about his journey from Marxist to, I believe he referred to himself as a Thomist by the end of that book.
Yeah, so I think you can divide up McIntyre's life, and this is, I think, what makes him just so interesting, into a number of different periods. The first period would be his sort of Marxist period, where he goes a little bit from different camps within the rich tapestry that is Marxism, and sort of. I think the best way to describe this is he comes to a sort of Trotskyite position. And yet one of the things he sees at this period, and it sort of brings it to an end, this is, I think, key for trying to understand McIntyre, and I would put it actually a very good way, a good question to pose to any thinkers is, when they change their mind, do they have a good account of why they changed their mind? Do they have an account of what problem they were unable to solve in the old way of thinking that they're now able to solve in the new way of thinking? And what McIntyre saw was that the Marxist paradigm as it was developing, this is sort of in the 50s now, when he's still a young man but already a fairly accomplished philosopher. The problem that the Marxist paradigm was missing is that it couldn't give a moral critique of Stalinism. You could point out, like many Marxists did in the West, after the kind of definitive event that really shocked a lot of Marxists, and I think the British Communist Party lost a third of its membership almost overnight in response to this, was the Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956. Because it was seen as sort of a naked display of imperialism, a naked display of power. That shocked a lot of communists, and they realized what the Soviet Union was at that point. But McIntyre's concern was, well, can you actually philosophically justify your criticism? And he felt that what was missing in the Marxist paradigm was the capacity to provide that robust philosophical justification as to why Stalinism was wrong. And the temptation that a lot of people fell into at the time and afterwards was to just adopt the liberal language, to just jump to the language of autonomy, of liberal individualism, of human rights, and not think any deeper on it. So, and then here's the problem, of course, for someone operating within the Marxist tradition, and why this jump shouldn't be a natural one, even though many people made it, is that Marxism is extremely critical of liberalism, extremely critical of the language of rights, precisely because it sees the language of rights as a mask for the exercise of money, of interests. They're often a way that class interests are instrumentalized. So in a moment, it seemed like, there's McIntyre's perspective on it, it seemed like everyone had just dumped their whole understanding and their whole development of a tradition that was critical of the language of rights, the language of liberal morality, the language of liberal political institutions, just throwing that out the window and become unreflective liberals. And that bothered him immensely. He didn't have an answer at the time to this, and this is what I would characterize as the next stage of his sort of career, intellectual career, sort of in the 60s and 70s. He didn't have an answer to what we should develop in response to this. He recognized that Marxism, particularly Stalinism, had problems, and of course the liberal paradigm did. But he wanted to point out that the jump here for a lot of people really seemed arbitrary. They became unreflective liberals, and just sort of threw their Marxism off in the past. Oh, that was just a youthful fascination. I don't really believe that stuff anymore. Wasn't it nice when we all sat around and sang L'Internationale together and such? But those days are past. We're now good liberals moving on into the good liberal projects of the 60s and 70s. And McIntyre just couldn't do that. He couldn't make that jump. And so the next stage then was eventually in the sort of late 70s, early 80s is the work that puts him to develop After Virtue, which is he basically realizes that he's been stuck in thinking in very modern terms about modern options, Marxism, liberalism, or Kant, you could say, as a kind of quintessential liberal moral thinker. That these were the options on the table for him. And what about the ancients? What about Aristotle? What about the tradition of Aristotelian morality or Aristotelian ethics? And of course, he wasn't the first to think about this. There'd been in the English philosophical world very prominent philosophers such as Elizabeth Anscombe, who'd essentially been making a version of this kind of this argument for decades. And McIntyre, more or less from a different starting point, came to believe that, well, maybe we should reconsider the Aristotelian paradigm. And that's what you see in After Virtue. After Virtue's positive argument, it's got its negative argument, the criticism of liberalism, the criticism of the Enlightenment project. But the positive argument is the case for adopting Aristotelian ethics. And then just quickly on you mentioned the Thomism point. Sometime in the mid-1980s, he basically realizes that it's Thomism that is the fulfillment of the Aristotelian tradition, that it's able to solve the problems, the philosophical problems that Aristotle himself couldn't resolve. So that's when McIntyre becomes a Catholic, becomes a Thomistic Catholic, and so he's writing essays from, and his philosophical writings from that point take on a Thomistic perspective. So that's where he stays until the end of his life in that camp, in the camp of Aristotelian Thomism, you might say. And then just to speak to your other question about where does it fit in to be post-liberal in all this, or what kind of post-liberalism does McIntyre point towards? Well, on the one hand, there's this critical apparatus, which is basically for us to understand that if we're going to make progress in moral philosophy, remember the image of fragmentation, and this is not a place we can leave off on. This is not a good situation to be, and we need to fix this. So there's a notion, and McIntyre very much believes this. It's a notion that we need to get back to making progress in ethics, get back to making progress in moral philosophy. And liberalism is not the way to do that. Liberal categories are not the way to do that. So he's post-liberal in that sense, in that he wants to leave liberalism behind and develop, with the help of Aristotle, Thomas Aquinas, that kind of pre-modern apparatus, develop the guides for a new way of thinking about philosophy and ultimately a new way of thinking about politics. So that's the post-liberal trajectory. That's where we get it from him. He's reluctant, though, in that, and this is a point I make in the article, a couple other people have made this as well, that like Hegel, there's a kind of left McIntyreanism and there's a right McIntyreanism. With Hegel, we talk about a left Hegelianism and a right Hegelianism. And with Hegel, the kind of historical irony is that probably Hegel is more on the side of right Hegelianism and the kinds of institutions and certainly his religious formation he points more towards in that direction. But after Hegel passes from the scene, it's the left Hegelians who really ascend. Marx comes out of that tradition, for instance, of left Hegelianism. With McIntyre, it's kind of the opposite, that McIntyre himself is partial to this sort of, let's try to draw from the resources of the left, the resources of Marxism as much as possible, very suspicious of anything that looks like conservatism, very hostile to Anglo-American conservatism. He has only nasty things to say about Burke, for instance. But the people who get really energized by McIntyre decades on now are people who are coming out of some kind of conservative education. They're people of the right. So right McIntyreanism seems to be the movement that has taken off. Left McIntyreanism doesn't have a lot of, there are of course some people who are deeply engaged with this, but it's not a widespread movement. Right McIntyreanism, you could say, has had a lot of various intellectual children. It's been quite. It's been definitely a movement that is expanding and has a sense of has the energy, has a sense of growth. So that's the reluctant part in this whole picture.
Well, thinking about where we might be then. Now and what might develop as to the governing philosophies, whether they're pushed by a different regime or whether it's pushed by this what's the right word? Discomfort is putting a too mild a word on it, but whether it's pushed by an organic growth through the restlessness of people who are no longer wanting to live under this fragmented world. So to bring that into less abstract terms, so let's talk about Western nations typically being run along the hard multicultural lines, which is we're going to be heavily pluralist, we're going to be relativist, which is to say that all cultures effectively are not to be judged by the same standards, but they're all also equally valid, the same, endowed with the same dignity, and we're not to pass judgment. Now, I think what we can see through this hard multiculturalism, which usually involves subverting a national culture, whether there are religious elements to that, so in the West through the Christian culture, or whether it's just more broadly the cultural norms of peoples that have populated those lands for however many hundreds and thousands of years, is you now have most people sitting outside of the anywhere class, as David Goodhart would call it. And even amongst those now, I'm starting to notice going, hang on, I'm not too sure the world in which we live is particularly good. So people don't like that they see the loss of cultural icons and times like Easter and Christmas, and then the promotion of other holy festivals of other religions throughout the course of the year. They don't like seeing the social enemy on the streets, so they can go on Twitter or anywhere and see video upon video of cities just falling apart, whether it's through ethnic conflict or whether it's through a kind of societal breakdown, increase in violence. And so they see that the current prevailing order is effectively the promotion of tolerating the intolerable, and intolerable because of either cultural dissolution or because you're effectively having to live amongst the ruins of what you know was a once great civilization, even if, of course, all civilizations, to do the usual British caveat, would have had dark parts to them, right? So I guess if he was pushing for let's return to the pre-modern elements. This is where we need to build out a healthy society once more. Is there have been others who followed him since then. So I know the editor for First Things, R.R. Reno, wrote his book, The Return of the Strong Gods, which is about nationalism and populism. But he was suggesting that, you need to tether those to something that is good and true and beautiful. In his respect, that's the Bible, that's Christianity. And McIntyre said at the end of wrote at the end of After Virtue, his final 2 chapters were on choosing one way or the other. One of them was the Thomas Aquinas way, Thomism, and thus aligning with Roman Catholicism, or the other was Nietzsche, who he saw as the anti-philosopher, someone who was basically disavowing all of the modern liberal or political ideologies, and even Christianity as well, but saying, look, we need to go back to the past if we're ever going to make anything of ourselves. So I know, Nathan, you do write about the current affairs as well. What do you see as the potential pathways now that this liberal order, the international liberal order, appears to be collapsing? What prospects do you see of this return to pre-modern ideals, and in what form could they take, do you think?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for McIntyre, of course, the issue here is the philosophical language we draw upon. So, and this is perhaps coming out of his background as a Marxist. He's very hesitant to talk about restoring or rebuilding old communities, pre-modern communities as they were, because as his fellow leftists will say, well, these or as you alluded to there, they have a very dark side as well, and we wouldn't want to bring back those. So he sees this as kind of a project to find and develop the moral language that we need, the language of ethics, and to try to instantiate that in certain practices, and to build that out through our activity. There's a lot to be said for that approach, but I think the limit that people run into, and this is sort of a classic criticism of McIntyre, is this isn't really politics in the way that we now experience it today. This is kind of perhaps an obsession with local spaces, with fishing villages, with a very small communities as the place to start, and there's a lot of value in that. But the way that we experience politics, and this is partly because of technological change and the way that we've organized our societies, is a much, much larger scale. So there's a limit with McIntyre. I think a lot of people who read him run into that problem at some point and sort of perceive that as a drawback. And the other thing I'd say too is that he's very good at describing the problems of fragmentation and the problems of breakdown. But what exactly the scripts are that are available to us have shifted quite dramatically since the 1980s or even the early 1990s, when he's really at the sort of zenith of his intellectual career and talking about this. One thing I'd put it in, and this is something that I've written about, but something that I think is just more and more the case, is that we already live coming out of that era in a post-liberal world. It's just not the one that McIntyre would describe as his sort of ideal form of post-liberalism, because the categories have changed for how we're governed, how we organize society, what our kind of concepts or key concepts are, have changed so much. So you mentioned the kind of multiculturalism problem here. I think this is a key one, whereby to actually apply multiculturalism in the way that you're talking about, which we have done in nearly all Western countries for some time, is an asymmetrical application. It's what you gestured to there. It's a sense that the historic majority needs to abandon its identity, needs to abandon its ethos, but the minorities get to keep theirs, preserve theirs, and in fact, we use the power of the state to enhance their identity, to build it up. This is asymmetrical. This is unequal. This requires all the things that you see now and read about now. It requires affirmative action. It requires preferential hiring practices. It requires you to organize the political economy of the state to favor those groups. It requires you, very British problem, but other countries have had this issue too. It requires you to cover up for their crimes because there's a risk of unrest if people know too much about what is happening. And from the perspective of asymmetrical multiculturalism, you could understand why you would do that. It's so important to preserve the kind of order that we have, to preserve the notion that we can all live together harmoniously, that if there are accounts of either cartels or small groups that are engaging in all kinds of some of the most sinister and wicked crimes, it's better that people don't know about that. It's safer because of the threat that might pose to order. So this is a world, I think, when we see, I think, what was going on in the late 90s and the 2000s to kind of keep this going. This is a world whereby we've left that whole aspect behind. So I would put it that the options on the table now, philosophically, I think McIntyre is right in the sense that it is sort of a Nietzsche or Aristotle question. But politically, in terms of how we fill this out, the options are really, do we lean more into this asymmetrical multiculturalism, or do we try to reverse it? But I think what's key here is that no matter what we do, the tools we're going to be drawing upon are not going to be liberal tools. They're going to be tools that are post-liberal, that require us to abandon certain traditional liberal categories or put those aside. I'll give one example of what I mean here, just to be concrete about it. Right, to make affirmative action stop happening in American universities, what you have to do, because the university system is so attached to it, because the people running the university are so attached to it, is you have to put them under pretty constant government surveillance. You have to look at their hiring practices. You have to monitor them to make sure they're not in breach of the Civil Rights Act, to make sure they're not discriminating against anyone. That requires constant monitoring. That's kind of what the Civil Rights Act required in the first place. But my point here is that to get one back, if you're someone who says, Harvard should not ever be discriminating on the basis of race, and they have a history of doing that, and we can document that and see how that's happened. Now we have a Supreme Court case that demonstrates that they were doing that for some time, and confirms that that's illegal, and unconstitutional. In order to get to a world where Harvard does not discriminate on the basis of race, you have to monitor Harvard on a pretty consistent basis and punish them for infractions, maybe withdraw their funding. Other options are on the table too. But this is not freedom of association anymore. This is not you sitting back under the liberal principle and saying, well, the university can run, because it's a private institution, because it's a private corporation, it can run and organize itself however its members please. A liberal principle, a freedom of association principle that you can see very eloquently defended in John Locke, right, and elsewhere. But to get out of that order, you have to draw upon tools that are not liberal, to get out of the order of racial discrimination. And I think that's the dilemma that a lot of us face now, is that you have people who, for very liberal reasons, do not want to see discrimination on the basis of race. For very liberal reasons, do not want to see a judicial system that provides preferences in whether it's in sentencing guidelines or whether it's just in sweeping stories about sexual abuse under the rug, not addressing it, not having inquiries. You want to have people treated equally in equal circumstances, in the same circumstances. Sorry. And so no discrimination, no preferential sentencing on the basis of race. But how do you get back to that system? Because we have been operating in it for a very long time. And in order to push it back to something like that, you are going to have to draw upon tools that are not going to be the quote unquote liberal tools. So this is, I think, the problem that we face now. And it's not just a British problem. It's not just an American problem. It's really a civilizational level problem.
So effectively what we're saying is that when those who want to move the dial away from this are going to be getting into power, they effectively need to be willing to use the machinery of the state and the power that is behind it to wrench control from the previous regime holders. It's effectively regime change. It's a counter movement to whatever we have now. And I suppose Trump in Trump 2.0 is an excellent example of it in some of the things that he's done. Is that if you compare it to his first term, he swept to power, wasn't able to get an awful lot done in his first term, partly because he was obfuscated all along the way. But then 4 years out of office, he ended up with this whole counter-regime movement that came behind him. Even people who were of the previous regime going, actually, yeah, I see which way the wind's blowing, I'll jump on board. And then was able to come along and just start changing things, writing executive orders and all the rest of it, going, no, I know how power works. I suppose we've seen it in the United Kingdom, albeit not in the same direction. So when we get a Labour government, they know how to use power. And so they come and go, right, we've got a particular vision and we are going to use every part of the state apparatus to bring that vision to life. Whereas the Conservatives were effectively accused of both partly being on board with the same vision as the Labour Party, but also partly just going, well, can't really do anything because we're relying on liberal discourse to change things. But of course, no one else is playing that game, only you were. So let's think about the technological impact on politics. We've talked a little bit about technocracy, I suppose, the rule by an expert class, albeit we've been alluding to it. And we've been making allusions to the impact of technology on politics. Maybe we can open up as a bit of a free format here, Nathan. When you and your contemporaries are talking about living in the age of the machine and what that means for our politics and our culture, what is it that you're trying to get at? What is it that you're trying to describe about the world in which we live?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are a couple of features. One is we're talking about a tendency to perceive. Let me phrase it like this. In the very first place, by raising this kind of question, this kind of framing, we're inviting someone to think about a technology in a different way, that it's not something that is just neutral, that sort of sits in the background, is invisible, and can be used for whichever purpose the person who picks it up can have, something distant, a kind of an object on a shelf, perhaps, that we pick up or put back on as we need it. It's rather for us to think about technology not as something neutral, and I think the specific way that's important for us to think about is something that is already reshaping the way that we live, and reshaping who we are and how we understand our own humanity, and to push it even further, reshaping our very conception of humanity itself. And I think there's two ways that once you see technology as something, and as the machine as something visible, once you begin to notice it, once you begin to at least see what I just said there about the potential for it to reshape our consciousness, ourselves, as something that is intelligible, and maybe you're somewhat skeptical of that frame, but you say, okay, I think I understand what he's getting at. I understand my smartphone addiction and how I can't put it down. The way that social media has redefined how I interact with people. Okay, I'm with you on that point, Dr. Pinkoski. But what else is going on? And I think there are two things that I would want to draw attention to. One is that the way technology has reshaped our political order is something that I think we're coming now to better understand, how a lot of the way that we organize our politics is downstream of certain technological changes that render certain policies or render certain ways of organizing our political order possible. A classic example that I think many of us now realize just how extensive it was is the kinds of measures that were imposed in 2020, 2021 with respect to the pandemic. That was only possible in a world whereby we had the capacity to take a great deal of our activities, or to put a little more provocatively, a particular class had the capacity to put most of its activities online. In a kind of Zoom room, in Skype sessions, to move their activities where they didn't actually have to go into an office and physically meet people, but could do more or less the same thing online. And because of that possibility, at least for that class of people, you were able to basically see the policy measures as well. Look, we can implement this, and there's not going to be any radical disruption of your life. No one's going to be cutting the power. The power is still going to be there. You can still do your work. You can still be an upstanding member of the laptop classes, producing all that you normally do. But we're just not going to see each other anymore. And what I want us to be aware of here is that to think in those ways was only possible because we had something like the internet at hand, ready to render that kind of strategy or way of thinking intelligible for us as a live option, and that's what happened. And so the takeaway here is that we've already passed through a political moment, or a historical moment, I guess I should say, where our technology did change what was possible politically and oblige us to reorganize our whole politics. Because of course, this wasn't actually something that was, perhaps it's minimally disruptive if most of your work is already online. But to make that whole system work, as we well know, required a great deal of changes from everyone else in society to kind of make that one particular segment of the population carry on as they did before. It required very dramatic restructuring of everything else to the point whereby, well, we don't need to revisit COVID policies, but I think the disruption, say, to schools and how damaging that was to the minds and psychological educational formation of young people, to those who were older and lost the chance to have regular visitors. All this was rendered possible because we thought, well, we can do this and carry on, and the GDP line won't be too badly disrupted. And if it is, we'll just throw more money around, et cetera, et cetera. So again, point here is that technology made that kind of policy options possible and required us to radically reconfigure the state and reconfigure the way that we used both government and social power during that time. And what we could discuss as a kind of something downstream of this would be whether we see this as the natural outworking of something called managerialism, a kind of other ideological setup. So I think that's one thing. And the last point I'll say here, just quickly, I think, and it goes a little bit to the same kind of experience if we take the COVID years as sort of a characteristic phenomenon of how this rule by the machine works. It was a moment for the people who lived through it and were attentive to what was happening, whereby we saw our own conception of ourselves change. It became the way you had to interact with people, the way you had to do something fundamentally, deeply human, your social relations, all had to be mediated into an online virtual setting, and you were expected to be happy with this and like this. And what's key there is that we had a kind of demand that you would enjoy and you would find this new order humanly satisfying. Whether you were, and the kinds of things you have to push off to the side, whether it's the very young children who are upset and crying why they can't see their relatives, why they can't see their friends anymore, and just stunned by this and wondering if they did something wrong. These sort of experiences that the young people had during the pandemic. On the other side of it, older people who weren't allowed to have visitors and wasting away in loneliness. We're supposed to accept this as part of a good human order, a kind of a society ordered to the common good, a society ordered to human flourishing, where would do this. And of course, it was nuts. It was absolutely nuts, and required us to visibly look away from the pain of loneliness, the psychological suffering that young and old people were going through, to look the other way in the name of what we perceive to be a good human order, what we were being told was a good human order. And this is, I think, exactly what one's pointing at, or one's trying to point at when one talks about rule by the machine. It's forcing us to reimagine ourselves, what a good life looks like, what a good human life looks like, and forcing us to ignore, to look the other way whenever someone tries to draw attention to the real visceral pain, the real suffering, the real damage that this is doing to our humanity.
Listening to you talk about the damage being done to our humanity through the machine age, I suppose there are, from time to time, prophetic voices that crop up and point these things out. And you and others are doing that within the technological age of now, or at least its current iteration. You were somewhat taking me back to thinking about Thomas Carlyle, who I've become a little bit obsessed of late, where he was one of those first talking about the impact of the beginning of the machine age on the human condition, and just how degrading it was, and how it was the captains of industry. And I suppose that the analogous of the laptop class at the time that were creating policies and running the ship for not just their own benefits, but just as the world as they saw it. And it had this downstream impact on how everyone lived their lives. It brought them in from these kind of rural agrarian settings, which, by the way, I'm not going to romanticize in any particular way, but a settled, rooted community life that had been there for generations and generations and all the rest of it. And before you know it, you're there, and your whole day is, instead of it being rooted around the sun, you're rooted around the mill work or the steel refinery work or all the rest of it. And I suppose thinking about just how self-serving the captains of industry can be with regards to the policy framework and the economic environment is, I wonder if they're running out of roads. This is just me spitballing at this point, where the worship of the machine in some way, it's this utopian project. There's a mammonism to it because it's all about efficiency. It's all about being able to create as much money as possible and to try and find shortcuts to things. And if I think about the obsession with AI at the moment and trying to embed it in everything that an organization does, is effectively it's the laptop class now trying to outsource their thinking to something else, knowing that for a period they will actually create efficiencies to the point where they might make themselves a little bit less busy, less effort, make a lot more money, be able to scale it, but in the end might have just sawed off the branch upon which they were sitting on. And it makes me wonder if actually in the end the machine that has been worshipped and fed all of this effort might just show how neutral it is with regards to who it serves, when all of a sudden those jobs in the laptop class and those similar to it no longer exist, or at least have been reduced to the point of almost nothing, because the people running the industries have gone, oh, well, I could just have someone who can do the job 80% as well as the other person, but they do it in a 20th of the time, and that someone is a computer. So let's see just how far technological change begins to impact our politics, because it'd be quite interesting if the elite class starts to drop the portcullis when suddenly they've got the hordes running up the path towards them to take them out, when in the past it hadn't usually been. But Nathan, thinking about some of your other work before we let you go, because I know we're approaching the end of our conversation. So I suppose another preoccupation of the elite class is openness, whether it's open trade, open borders, all the rest of it. A book which was released in the 70s. It was written by a Frenchman, Jean Raspail. I probably totally butchered his name. Camp of I haven't. That's good. Camp of the Saints. It shows a world of open borders, specifically a world in the West in which peoples from much less developed nations, different social mores, a lack of civility, arrive en masse on the shores of a nation, and that nation takes them in because of the ideas that it has told itself are sacrosanct and cannot be transgressed in any way. It is a very expensive book to get your hands on because it effectively ended up in print for a while, and then because of its controversy, no other publisher would touch it. But Vauban Books has since gotten the rights to it, translated it, turned it into a book which is coming out again this year, and you decided to write a foreword to it. So perhaps you can tell us a little bit about why it became taboo and why you think it's made a comeback and the importance of its return.
Yeah, so the thing that I think, a couple of things that people should know about it, because it is a book that that sort of has been maligned by, or perhaps been taken up as too exciting by various versions of racialists, whether they're progressives or some other kind. But when you actually read the book, I think, first of all, if you know something about the author himself, you'll see why you can't really see it as a novel about a screed for racial supremacy. Raspail made his name as a travel writer. Someone who specifically went to far corners of the world and documented indigenous peoples that were disappearing. And what he was trying to do was to transmit their stories, to transmit their accounts before they vanished from the earth. He had, as a young man, particularly moving experiences traveling in North America, where he'd come across the remnants of what called First Nations or Native peoples their reserves or the abandoned villages, and being very much struck by the tragedy of this. So this isn't someone who views the third world as something that is, or the non-European world as people who are biologically inferior or something like that. He's someone who wanted to document their tragedy, the tragedy of many vanishing peoples before they slipped away from the earth. Second thing is that he's a very accomplished novelist. He won some of the most prestigious literary prizes in France for his other works, was nearly admitted into l'Académie Française, the highest kind of intellectual honor you can get. He won the majority, but you need a 2/3 majority to get in, so he didn't quite make it. But still won the highest literary prize they had to offer. So this is not someone who's a fringe figure. This is not someone who writes racialist screeds on the side or anything like that. I think once you know that and you go into the novel, then you're able to see it for what it is, which is a novel about our own, we in the West. It particularly focuses on France, but it's something that extrapolates further, and you can see it further. That it's about our own malaise and our own guilt, our own self-hatred, our own incapacity to understand our sense of worth. And what it does, and this is the part that I think makes it very relevant, is it's not really about who's coming from what corner of the world, what specific area. It's more using the device of 1 million migrants who are going to land in France as a mirror to see how we as a people, how we as a civilization in the West think about this, what kinds of categories we draw, and what he's trying to point at is our own sense of the logic of self-hatred and how that nihilism culminates in our own destruction. The breakdown in the novel, the ultimate breakdown of order in the West happens actually before the migrants land. Before they even land, the political order has fallen apart, and that's the key theme that he's trying to point out. And what we get from it now, I think, is you pick up this book and you really see how it has a deep, deep insight into the Western way of thinking that has become predominant since the 1970s. When Raspail wrote this, it was a fictional event. It was almost a fantastical event. You didn't have mass migration on the scale that we now have it today. The numbers that he refers to in the book, 1 million, these are rookie numbers, right, by present day terms, right? That's the amount that Germany brought in 2015, and then they brought in a similar amount in 2016 and so forth, right? You could make the same comparisons to Canada, or Britain's gone pretty close to that through the Boris wave, right? So again, it's a fantasy. It's a fictional novel that is meant to draw attention to a deeper malaise within our own condition, our own civilization. And those are the themes that resonate most when you read it, and why I think you can see and pick it up nowadays and see what a profoundly dystopian novel it is, in that it shows where this process of thinking takes us to our own destruction. Our own self-hatred will lead to our desire to destroy ourselves. There's really no other way to put it. And the other thing I'd say too is that what he's particularly good at is he's showing that it's not so much the problem that faces us is not so much a relativism or a lack of sense of meaning or purpose, a kind of aimlessness. And this actually goes back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago with respect to is Nietzsche still an option on the table? And I actually think that there are very few, to use a Nietzschean term, there are very few last men out there, in the sense of people who live their whole lives with a sense of just pursuing a particular material pleasure, and that's it, and they don't want to be bothered by anything higher. There obviously these people exist, but what tends to happen with those people is it's sort of like a halfway house. You get pulled into something else. You get pulled into some other deeper movement. And what Raspai is drawing attention to in the novel is that the spiritual energy that comes from the promotion of mass migration is ultimately it's a fake messianism. It's a false eschatology, where you look upon migration as some sort of world historical, almost quasi-theological movement that is supposed to save us in some way. The migrant has a special capacity to heal our wounds, to heal our civilization. And you can put that in different directions too, right? Maybe it's to deal with our historic legacy of racism. Maybe it's to work harder than we do because we don't know how to work anymore, and they'll do the jobs that we don't do anymore. So there are various ways you can spin this, and there are left-wing versions of this and right-wing versions. But the broader issue there is a kind of messianism of some sort, a kind of messianic, to use the theological term, right? This is soteriology of migration, a soteriology that is attributed to the migrant, where he's supposed to have the capacity to save us in some way. And Raspai is very good for pointing that out, for drawing attention to the spiritual energy of that project. It's not something that is empty. There are people who genuinely think this, and they use all the power that they have, whether it's in the NGO world, whether it's in the legal world, whether it's in the representative institutions, in the government, to advance that. And he's able for us to see that as one of the great. I think rightly understood, spiritual movements that exist in our time. It's a kind of religion of humanity. It's a kind of Christian heresy, but it is a spiritual movement with a lot of energy. And so if you see that as one of the principal problems or conundrums we face in the West today, I think we can get past an earlier iteration, that a lot of us, or was very popular kind of in an earlier time, where we say, our problem is just relativism. No one believes in anything anymore. We do believe in something, but the energy of that, the logic of it, will be something that takes us to our own destruction. And so if you pick up this novel, and I encourage people to do it, because now you have the chance, I think, and the price is very affordable, right? $24.95 on Amazon, right? For paperback edition. You can actually read this and see what is, I think, one of the great dystopian novels of our time, one that should just be read as just as relevant as 1984 or Brave New World. The other one that comes to mind is Children of Men. All these four novels, I think, if you read them alongside each other, you'd really get an unparalleled insight into the problems that face us in the 21st century.
Yeah, and a final footnote on that before I ask the question I ask all of my guests, Nathan, is that Vauban books seem to be on a serious run of form with regards to helping the public understand the moment we're in. So probably as controversially, if not more so, is there was a translation of The Enemy of the Disaster, a series of essays by Renaud Camus, who is the chap who is attributed for coming up with the great replacement theory. He will contend I never added the theory bit. I'm just describing the age we live in, replacism, which is to say that our leaders ultimately treat us all like undifferentiated human matter. You can move us all around. It doesn't matter where we are, where we're from. We're just all contributing to the machine. But the problem is they've destroyed the civilization that we once knew and loved in the meantime, and it's a shadow of its former self. And he says it's the crime of the 21st century. It's caused great harm. And it's quite interesting because it only came out in English less than 2 years ago. And to see the spread of that directly and indirectly into discourse amongst public intellectuals and commentators across the political sphere has been huge. And Camp of the Saints has effectively been behind a cordon sanitaire since the 70s, because apart from the people who wanted to go and spend the £100 to go and get a tatty used version of the book from eBay, no one's had a chance to read it. So I dare say it will contribute more to the discourse as you've been talking about. But finally, Nathan, because I know you've got to go, is the question, which very much embodies the spirit of intellectual humility, which we talked about with Alasdair MacIntyre. And that is, what have you changed your mind on in the course of your life? It might have been an absolute or maybe something not quite as consequential. And what was it that made you think differently?
Yeah, one of the things that comes to mind, and this is perhaps something that speaks to the British context a bit, is, as I said, I grew up in Canada. And if you're someone who grows up in Canada and for a number of reasons sort of leans conservative, you end up idealizing a lot of British institutions. You look towards the Great Alliance of the English-speaking peoples, right? This kind of thing, and that was something that shaped a lot of my thinking when I was young, in my kind of early 20s or so. But what I realized from that, and there was one particular experience I'll recount in a second, that was that a lot of that was wrapped up in a kind of liberal internationalism, which was maybe very well suited to a particular moment, and doesn't have the same value anymore, and can in fact mislead us. And one of the ways that I discovered this was early when I first came to Oxford. This was just when the Arab Spring was getting started. So this would have been 2011. And I was invited to be on this. As a student, I was invited to be on this panel with some of the great luminaries who were engaged in this. There was a BBC correspondent from the Middle East, so someone who spent most of his professional career writing about the Middle East. There were a couple academics who were specialists in the area. And then there was me, and then there was one other student. So two students as part of this discussion who were kind of brought in, given this opportunity. So I was, on the one hand, I was very excited to speak alongside these and also too, because at this time I'm there joining Oxford. I idealize this wonderful institution of higher learning. The BBC is always looked upon as kind of a superior version of the CBC. Yes, the CBC in Canada has its problems, but the BBC is a whole other standard. So I was almost very humbled to be there and in awe of this. And but my talk was going to be on why the Arab Spring wasn't working out. And I wrote it up, and I thought afterwards, oh, this is not going to be anything interesting. Everyone else is going to say exactly the same thing. And this was at the moment, too, whereby just on the timeline here, it was clear that Assad's government wasn't going to fall. And the way that it was playing out in Egypt was with the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, and then the militaries pushed back against that. So just so we know the timing of it here. So I was just pointing out some of these details and saying, well, look, has there really been this promise that we're expecting to see about a great democratic revolution across the whole Middle East is not taking place? And that actually is most of the way that these sort of historical references or historical revolutions play out. Most of them are failures. So I had this argument. I thought, this is clear from just looking at the scene. Everyone's going to make this point. I'll have nothing original to say. Oh, well, I guess that's just what happens when you speak along distinguished luminaries. And it turned out I was the only one who had that point of view. Everyone else was all starry-eyed about how the democracy was going to sweep the Middle East. And they made fun of me. They made fun of me as this young student who's there standing alongside them. I said something like, a cursory glance at Wikipedia will show you a list of most uprisings, and most of them end in failures. They don't end in change. And I can't remember who it was, whether it was the BBC journalist or the academic, were deriding me for making reference to this. So I didn't really think of this at the time. It's only something that I realized later on was a sort of typical strategy to deal with this. But what I did realize at the time was the kind of awe, the kind of reverence I'd had with these people and the particular institutions that they represented, and the particular worldview that I thought had something that was insightful, that could help us understand the troubles of our own time, did not live up to that. And so in McIntyrean terms, it was kind of like an epistemological crisis, whereby you look at these people that you've exalted and you admired, at least from a distance, and you think very highly of them. And then when you actually see the way they operate, and importantly for McIntyre, right, their inability to describe what's actually going on, because of course the Arab Spring did not produce a sweeping wave of democracies all across the Middle East. I happen to be right, but that's not the main point here. The main point is that for me at this young, I was 23 at the time. For me, what that did is it turned me away from trust in the mainstream or legacy institutions that I admired, and particularly the ones that I associated with a kind of English-speaking political order, liberal internationalism, for lack of a better term, that was supposed to have special insights to guide it. I think from that point onwards, I became much more interested in things that were on the fringe, ideas, things that weren't necessarily honored in the mainstream. I was ready to go looking elsewhere after that point. And maybe that goes to just a broader sense of the experience that many people have, many British people have now too, is that, as I said, you're growing up in Canada, if you lean conservative in some way, you tend to idealize Britain and the British constitutional order. But throughout my 20s, more and more I realized how much had changed, how much had been lost, how revolutionary the 90s were in Britain, how deep the constitutional order was overhauled. So I think by the time that I was finished there, I'd really begun to see the world in a very different way. I think the important thing, that what it taught me, is that I'd been inclined to see things in terms of continuity, kind of long institutional continuity, going back to 1945, maybe going back further, maybe going all the way back to Magna Carta, right? These sorts of things. And I was much more attentive to looking for ruptures, looking for breaks, and looking for them when other people were saying that they weren't there. So yeah, that would be, I think, that one of the big moments that sticks with me, that I reflect on occasionally, and probably was fairly significant for pushing my thinking in other directions. Otherwise, I would just be a normal liberal internationalist, enjoying a good academic career, writing about the great books on one hand and complaining about the people overturning the post-war international order, right? The post-war rules-based order on the other hand, and it'd be very much in the mainstream institutions. But
that's yes, a fascinating account. And actually, whilst not everyone will get the chance of going and being on a panel at an august institution like Oxford, and that's the moment that they realise that, oh, some of these vaunted institutions actually aren't quite as bulletproof as we give them credit for, is I feel like that's almost where we're at with regards to people who very much haven't been through that elite education. They look at the BBC, they look at the British state, they look at all of them, and they just don't trust a word that is said. And if you go on any article that even talks about Keir Starmer or Keir Starmer's LinkedIn profile or anything the BBC puts out, it doesn't matter whether they are right-leaning or old left from the former mining towns, or increasingly people like Tunbridge Wells man, who realise that the established order has almost nothing of its former self in there, and actually people cannot trust them. And I think everyone in some way is on their own journey toward looking around the fringes, as you have been. And I suppose people find different answers and all the rest of it. But it's fascinating that that seems to be the experience of so many now, and something that certainly I can empathize with. Before I let you go, Nathan, where can people find you and your writings, and what can we expect from you next?
Yeah, so I have a Substack, pinkoski.substack.com, also Lament for the Nations. That's where I post most of my writings there. I tend to write for either the magazine First Things or for Compact. And those are the two venues I tend to write most for. And then what's coming up is we have the new edition of Camp of the Saints out. I encourage people to look into that. I'm doing the first English translation of Éric Zemmour, the French presidential candidate in 2022, doing the translation of his book, The Suicide of the French, for Encounter Books. That should be out next year. And then my own book, tentatively titled Actually Existing Post-Liberalism, is under contract with Basic Books, and I'll be finishing that this year. So those are some things to look forward to if you to have on your radar for the coming months and for the next calendar year.
Well, more power to you, Nathan. I'll include the links for the books that you have pre-orders and all the rest of it on there, and also to your Substack so people can check those out. I'll certainly look forward to reading them, keep fighting the good fight, and hopefully we get into the weeds on some of these interesting topics again in future.
Indeed. All right. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
To keep up to date with all that I am doing, please subscribe to the Thinking Class YouTube channel @ThinkingClass and follow me on X @ThinkingClasses. Thinking Class seeks to understand the civilizational issues we face and why what our leaders do in response matters. Here, I seek to explore the ideas, values, and culture that made our civilization, those that are unmaking it, and how leaders at our public and private institutions should respond. Engage with me on YouTube or X, or write to me at thinkingclasspod@gmail.com to tell me who you want me to speak to and what topics are important to you. I look forward to seeing you there and for joining me on this journey.